Hi, Diana.
Hi, Sharon.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm going to make you a co-host because you're the chair for this, but I'm a little slow on the technology, so let me just figure it all out, okay?
So am I. So I really
Okay, great. Okay,
appreciate
good. 1 second on this. There we go. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to make you a co-host. There you go. You should be a co-host.
Uh-huh. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Now I'm trying to figure out the chat. Are you having a good conference so far?
Yes, I've been to some great sessions in the plenary.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. It's been very interesting.
Yeah. So I want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly. Is it Aili Pettersson?
Yeah, exactly. You got it right. Aili Pettersson.
Okay.
Thank you for checking in about it.
Did you say Peterson or Pettersson?
Pettersson.
Okay. I
Thank
did.
you.
I did one of those online pronunciation things and they said Peterson. So thank you.
Okay, well, I'm fine either way. Thank you for checking in about it though. And thank you also for chairing this panel.
Oh, sure. Looking forward to it. Hello, Tomo, is it Tomo?
Yes, my name is Tomo. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And I tried an online pronunciation and they said your last name is Nakadoi.
My last name is Nakadoi.
Oh, Naka.
Yeah,
Could you say that
So-
again, please?
yeah. I'm sorry. My last name is Nakadoi. But yeah. Please call me Tomo. Just Tomo. This is my
Oh.
first name. Yeah.
Oh, you don't want to be introduced with your last name as well?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Please. Thank you.
So, hi, I just wanted to say I am making everybody who is a presenter a co-host. I was just told to do that. And then I'm assuming the chat is enabled and because I'm also chat moderator. So I'm hoping once you post a question that everybody will be able to see it. So, yeah.
Okay, hello.
Hi, Jeanne.
Hi Jeanne. Hi Emery. Hi Diana. Hi Tomo. Hello Aili. Is it Aili? Aili.
Hi, it's
Hi.
Aili.
Aili. Okay, sorry.
No
Sorry.
worries at all. Thank you for checking.
Sharon and Suzanne and Kai. Great. And Anne Marie, it's very late where you are. It's what, 12 o'clock or is it 11 o'clock?
It's 11,
Okay, 6 hours.
way past my bedtime, but I almost changed into my pajamas in the break. I figured, better not. No, I'm
Yes,
curious
yeah.
about your talk, all your talk, really. So
Thank you.
I'll hang in there.
Yeah. And what time is it in Japan now, Tomo? Is it 5 or
Hi.
6 o'clock? 5, yeah.
yeah,
In
it
the
is.
morning.
Yeah,
Oh.
6 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, good morning.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the time at your end, Jeannie?
It's 5 o'clock in the evening. So,
Oh,
yeah.
That's pretty decent, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this means that Amy is getting up fairly early because I think there's a 2-hour time difference. So, so when she introduced us all this morning, it was 7. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Diana, is that your study? It's gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's the library room at the back of the house.
Wow. Well, I'm house sitting, so all of those tapes and books you see behind me are my friends.
Yeah, I cleaned a couple summers ago and moved every single book to dust it, and it's just under 3,000 volumes in the whole house.
Yeah.
I know I look like I'm in a prison, but I'm actually in something we call in Wisconsin here a 3-season porch.
Every season but winter, I assume. Where in Wisconsin are you, Kelly?
Got it. I'm in La Crosse, right along the
Aw.
Mississippi River,
Okay.
the western edge of the state. And
Yeah.
yes, although those, the pandemic year where we were all in sequestered, I put a space heater out here and stayed out here with sweaters on for absolutely as long as possible. People started to look at me weird though when I started wearing hats, and scarves. So I stopped.
Well, Wisconsin gets cold. I lived in Racine a few years when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so good to see you.
Same.
I remember the walk we took in the 2016 conference,
Oh, yes.
the wonderful rainy, wet walk. Yeah.
Do we want to start?
Yeah, I was just looking, there's somebody else wanting to get in.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep monitoring that and then
Okay.
just post any questions, anybody to the chat, and hopefully we can all see those questions.
Okay, good.
All
Yes.
right.
And then we can also use the, for people who are happy with that, you can use the reaction, raise your hand at the end. But we're going to follow the usual conference format of I will introduce all the speakers. Then we can pause a few seconds in between, a moment or a minute or so in between, and then each can deliver your paper. And then we'll have all the questions at the end. So welcome then to the section on, to the panel on negotiating class, crafting intimacies. And thank you, Sharon, for being the host and chat moderator. Our first speaker will be Tomo Nakadoi. She is a full-time lecturer of English as a foreign language at Nagoya University of Foreign Studies in Japan. After leaving graduate school, after completing a doctoral course at Kobe City University of Foreign Studies in 2021, she has been working on a doctoral thesis about the rhetorical negotiation between different social classes in Woolf's later works. Her current focus of analysis is the aesthetics related to gendered bodies. One of her latest papers is The Embodiment of a Woman and Ethical Awareness in Mrs. Dalloway, published in Virginia Woolf Review, published by the Virginia Woolf Society of Japan in 2019. Her paper today is titled Enfolding Metaphors into the Lighthouse. Our second speaker is Jeanne Dubino. She is professor of English, Global Studies, and Animal Studies at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. She organized the 1997 Virginia Woolf Conference held in Plymouth, New Hampshire, is a member of the editorial board of the Virginia Woolf Miscellany and the Woolf Studies Annual, and served as the Secretary Treasurer of the International Virginia Woolf Society from 2000 to 2005 and from 2012 to 2015. Some of her most recent publications include edited volumes, essays, articles, and reviews on wolf, travel, and animal studies. She is currently working on a book on stray/street/free-ranging dogs in literature, and her paper today is Unkempt, Uncollared, and Living in a Gutter, the Street Dogs in Flush. And our third speaker is Aili Pettersson-Peker, who is a PhD candidate in English with an emphasis in cognitive science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her dissertation brings together literary studies, neurocognitive science, and philosophy of mind to rethink the relationship between empathy and literature. Examining the role that empathy has played in the production of the ideology of the individual, she turns to the fiction of Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison to explore more expansive models for fellow feeling. She is the research coordinator for the Trauma-Informed Pedagogy Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her paper today is titled Crosby, Sands, and McNab, Woolf Writing Working Women. And as I'm going to do now, I'll mute my mic. And if you're not speaking or asking a question later, please do the same.
Thank you, Diana. If I may, so shall we begin? Yeah. Hello, my name is Tomo Nakadoi. I'm from Japan. I'm very happy to join this conference today. Yeah, and so I'm very thank you for introduction. Yeah, and committee members of this conference. Yeah. So today's my topic is enfolding metaphors into the lighthouse. I will talk about metaphors into the lighthouse. Yeah. So I will paste today's documentation. This link includes my draft and PowerPoint slide. So if you need, please download them. Yeah. So I will share screen. So please wait. Yeah, can you see PowerPoint slide? Okay. Oh, thank you. So, okay, let's begin. So, yeah. The presentation's outline is as follows. It composed of 4 sections. Yeah. So, yeah, let's begin the interaction. Jessica Berman interpret an effect of reaching ethical realms between one subject and the other in the aesthetical usage of figurative language in Woolf's writings. Berman's interpretation is innovative in the point that regarding traditional women's gender identity as a rhetorical effect of aesthetics. Berman values this literal identity as to create an ethical relationship between or even with strangers of different principles by way of consideration for others, such as desire and care. However, we need to reconsider the ideology of the aesthetics. Berman considers aesthetics in Woolf's writings as equal to moral judgment. That means the viewer is more authorized than the other who is viewed. My point of criticism about Berman's interpretation is that it has the risk of concealing the viewpoint of the objectified or the weaker side. We need to consider the other side's subjectivity if we truly search for ethical communications in Woolf's writings. In order to take the other side's view into consideration, I propose to add metaphors to the target of analysis as another way of figurative expression of potential communication. The rhetoric of To the Lighthouse, including metaphors, links two different others for the middle-class society. One is emotional labor of women in the family, and the second is physical labor in the working class society. In this presentation, I claim that the effect of figurative languages, especially metaphors, have the effect of enfolding others for potential discourse. Let's go to the next section. The problem of the consideration for the absent other. According to Berman, the figurative language mediating ethical communications is called fold. Berman explains the function of the fold in Woolf's writings as follows. Please look at the next slide. An ethical realm, a fold between the potentially universal and the personal, or between the face of the other as a stranger and the code of the ethics of intimacy. The fold that Berman reads in Woolf's rhetoric is a portion of or belonging to the other, or a thing that separates inside and outside one's private dimension. By way of the fold, the viewer perceives the person as intimate, thus caring for, like someone in a close relationship. Fold induces the viewer to reaffirm one's recognition of the other. The curtain in Mrs. Dalloway is one example. When parting it, Clarice Dalloway comes to consider an old lady in the opposite room as real existence, like extension of her reality. The curtain as a fold gets Clarice to have concern for her. Yeah. We can find another example of this type of communication between Cam and McAllister in To the Lighthouse. After Mrs. Ramsay died in part 1, Mr. Ramsay, Cam, and James sailed to the lighthouse with the McAllisters. In the course of their trip, Cam compares the recollection of her childhood to her current situation on the boat. Yeah. She was thinking how all those paths and the lawn were past, were unreal, and now this was real, the boat and the sail with its patch, McAllister with his earrings, the noise of the waves, all this was real. Here, Cam feels more real in the present situation of the boat, the sails, the sound of the waves, and the McAllisters than in her memories of her childhood. We can see that she psychologically receives the reality of the McAllisters into her intimate sphere. Therefore, the patch of the sail and the earrings could be regarded as a fold for Cam to enter a fisherman's reality. The problem is that the perspective of the other side is not told. After all, one-sided psychological constellation functions only to foster the viewer's singular view. This imbalance risks manipulating the other's will, especially those in disadvantageous positions. I suggest that the nonverbal subjectivity in the silenced side is described in the form of physical metaphors. I propose this is another type of figurative communication in this novel. Let's go to the next section. Physical metaphors as exploitation of emotional or physical burden. The interaction between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay is exemplified using physical metaphors in part 1. For example, the metaphors relating to water and flower represent how she sympathizes with him. Next slide. Mrs. Ramsay seems to raise herself with effort and at once to pour erect into the air a rain of energy, a column of spray, and into this delicious fecundity, this fountain and spray of life, the fatal sterility of the male plunged itself like a beak of brass, barren and bare. He wanted sympathy. When she interacts with her husband, her attitude is objectified into organic substances, such as a rain of energy or a column of spray. These metaphors function as sympathy toward her husband. After encouraging her husband, her body is described as one petal closed in another, and the whole fabric fell in exhaustion upon itself. So these expressions suggest that Mrs. Ramsay is carrying the emotional burden in their marital relationship. These physical metaphors make the invisible emotional burden into something more visible. So these beautiful metaphors exemplify her devotion to her family on the emotional aspect as a moral labor and as a value of patriarchy. The unaccounted emotional reality in the patriarchy is juxtaposed with the labor situations of the working class in the middle class society. At the dinner party, Charles Tansley complains about the deteriorating measurement of working conditions of fishermen. However, Lily, Mr. Banks, and Mrs. Ramsay cannot truly empathize with him, even bored. Pulling her shawl round her, Mrs. Ramsay felt something was lacking, all of them bending themselves to listen, thought. Pray heaven that the inside of my mind may not be exposed for each thought. The others are feeling this. They are outraged and indignant with the government about the fishermen, whereas I feel nothing at all. Although they listen to Tansley, they all feel something was lacking, contrasted with the urging attitude felt by Tansley. Others around him feel bored. I feel nothing at all indicate that this problem is not actually felt by or imagined by them. This emotional gap between Tansley and others seems to derive from the difference in habitual behaviors. Tansley's grandfather was a fisherman. In the middle-class society or community centered around the Ramsays, the physical reality of the working class people has no place as an individual subjectivity. We can recall the similar episode in a dinner scene where Mrs. Ramsay complains about the inequity of the milk and butter supply in England. She is only laughed at by her family members. Her indignation about the social injustice is not listened to seriously by those around her, like when they listen to Townsley's complaint. So the hierarchy of the men and the women in patriarchy parallels that of social hierarchy in capitalism. The rhetorical expression of the consumable sponge to signify Mrs. Ramsay engaging emotional labor is analogous with the expression of resources, which is used for physical workers who are not considered individual by higher classes. Next section, transformation of the sea as a vehicle for potential communication with others. Based on the theory of Melanie Klein, Fujito Endo analyzes this story as an aesthetical reaction of the political struggle in the 1920s. He suggests that land and sea metaphors represent the boundary inside and outside middle-class society. He says the sea metaphor reflects middle-class ideological anxieties against the mass in the politics. The sea representation is a kind of psychological projection of inner sadism onto the social other. I'd like to add to this claim that Mrs. Ramsay, metaphor in the forms of an animated object, is another outside the middle-class society. This is because her subjectivity, including her feeling, has not yet been realized or verbally explained. Among the metaphors, these relating to water are the link between the two outsides of middle-class society, namely Mrs. Ramsay and the working-class reality. With water, Cam and McAllister get in touch outside of the Ramsay family in part 3. Their communication with C during the trip to the lighthouse functions as rhetorical and semiological meanings. This conduct expresses human subjectivity free from the binary opposition between men and women. When Cam's hand cut a trail in the sea, the waves are exemplified into cloth metaphor, as Mrs. Ramsay is described in this way in part 1. Her hand cut a trail in the sea, wandered in imagination in that underworld waters, where the pearls struck in clusters to white sprays, where in the green light a change came over one's entire mind, and one's body shone half transparent enveloped in a green cloak. Her physical contact to waves recalls Mrs. Ramsay's green shawl in part 1. She folded the green shawl about her shoulders. The waves as green cloak create imaginative link between Mrs. Ramsay's body and the sea in the reader's imagination. Therefore, the waves Cam touches imply the double meanings, physical seawater and Mrs. Ramsay's attire in a metaphorical way. Outside of the father-son dialogue between James and Mr. Ramsay, Cam meets the fisherman along with Mrs. Ramsay as waves of the sea. Both are absent from the middle-class community in the first part. These others, as metaphysics, come to exist in Cam's reality in part 3. Transformation of sea metaphors involves those two types of outside reality to middle class. So metaphors into Lighthouse reveal submerged realities in a particular community by visualizing them in metaphorical object. They can be read as some possibility for a mutual dialogue, as well as a tactful concealment of the middle class ideology. That's all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tomo, excuse me, for that thought-provoking analysis. So when you're able, if you could stop sharing your screen. Thank you. And then Jeanne, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. I was putting in the link for Tomo's paper, and now I'm going to put in the link for those who had come in a little later. And now I believe I just put in the link for my paper. So why don't I share my screen? And here we are. Let me get to the presentation mode. So yes, street dogs. Unkempt, uncollared, and living in a gutter, the street dogs in Flush. The woman on the left was famous for rescuing street dogs actually around the time that Woolf was alive. And the one on the right is a picture of street dogs actually in Turkey, then the Ottoman Empire around the time that Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Flush and family were in Italy. So scholarship on Flush focuses on the canine protagonist of the novel or his human counterpart. This paper attends to the appearance of one set of minor characters in the novel, the street dogs. Characters might be an overstatement. The street dogs of Flush are unnamed and not individuated. They tend to function as the foils, or to refer to Tomo's paper as the others, against which Flush defines himself. As foils, however, they play a crucial role. In England, Flush classifies the uncollared as low dogs, against which he is a dog of birth and breeding. In Italy, on the other hand, all dogs are his brothers. Flush's shifting relationship to street dogs seems to mark his trajectory from a snob to an egalitarian. And yet, Flush's conversion, when the last threads of his old fetters fell from him, is not driven as much by his own ethical agency as it is by his environment. Eminently adaptable, as dogs often are, Flush experienced his moment of liberation from a class-bound Weltanschauung to an embrace of a classless society in a world like the canine version of Italy that does not valorize breed. In this paper, I discuss how Woolf, through her anthropomorphized depiction of Flush and his relationship to his uncollared counterparts, enjoins readers to see how behavior, including ethical considerations, is shaped by social context. Woolf vivifies the social context of Britain and Italy, however idealized the latter is, with her characterizations of its street dogs, just as in novels like Mrs. Dalloway, she represents people on the street whom it is easy to disregard, so does she in Flush draw readers' attention to a class of characters who are unkempt and uncollared and pick up a living in the gutter. In Disfigured Figures, David Galeff focuses on the human miniatures who appear in Woolf's novels. His description could equally apply to the street dogs of Flush. Virginia Woolf's miniatures, those briefly described figures that do so much to anchor the world in her novels, are both myriad and vivid. They seem to represent adamant pieces of reality in an otherwise malleable fictional structure. As moving images, they may persist in the reader's mind long after the major figures have faded. The gamut of figures in Woolf runs from insects to adult Homo sapiens, end quote. Galeff addresses specifically disabled and generally named characters, such as Captain Barfoot in Jacob's Room and Mr. Pepper in The Voyage Out. Woolf's most famous street miniatures appear most prominently in Mrs. Dalloway, including the named characters Sarah Bletchley with her baby in her arms, Emily Coates, who thinks of the housekeeping details in Buckingham Palace, and little Mr. Bowley, an elderly gentleman with an Aberdeen Terrier, all of whom stop to stare at the airplane in the sky. More significant, perhaps, are the appearances of the unnamed old men and old women, especially this rusty pump, this battered old woman with one hand exposed for coppers, the other clutching her side. Mrs. Dalloway's free-roving narrator draws readers' attention to these street characters, some of them homed and others, like this battered old woman, presumably not. In Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf places unnamed human characters on the street and from time to time fleetingly reminds readers of the precarity of life for those who, it seems, live there. And this is from Razia's point of view. Oh, poor wretch. Suppose it was a wet night. Suppose one's father or somebody who had known one in better days had happened to pass and saw one standing there in the gutter. And where did she sleep at night? Cries the not so minor character Razia. In Flush, Woolf turns readers' attention to the dogs who, in fact, do live on the street. Setting part of her imagined canine biography in the London of the 1840s, around 8 decades earlier than that of Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf represents the miniatures of Flush's doggy world. We see the street dogs from Flush's perspective. Having lived in the countryside at 3 Mile Cross in Berkshire, where he had, quote, mixed impartially with the tap room dogs and the squire's greyhounds and known no difference between the tinker's dog and himself, Flush moves to a world where dogs are strictly divided into different classes. And these were a series of quotations that I read. And this is my list. Chained and wild, living in luxury or in the depths of the gutter, high and low, purebreds or mutts. This clear-cut 2-column chart of dichotomies echoes Charles Baudelaire's poem, Good Dogs, published around the same time as the historical setting of Flush in 1866. Fie upon the foppish dog, upon the coxcomb quadruped, Dane, King Charles, pug dog or lap dog, so enamored of himself, often surly and insolent as a servant. I sing the dirty dog, the poor dog, the homeless dog, the stroller dog, the dog buffoon, the dog whose instinct, like that of the poor, the gypsy, and the mountebank, is marvelously sharpened by necessity. At this point in his London life, Flush does not sing the dirty dog, the poor dog, the homeless dog, the stroller dog, the dog buffoon. Upon his realization that, quote, there is no equality among dogs, there are high dogs and low dogs, end quote, he is greatly relieved, heaven be praised, he thinks, to see as he looks at himself in a mirror that he himself is, quote, a dog of birth and breeding, end quote. He takes on the human created classism of his fellow hybrid dogs who deride street dogs as scallywags and mere mongrels, both quotations. Flush's social class will not, of course, protect him. Even, especially, a dog of birth and breeding is not safe in an anthropocentric, class-bound world. In the world of humans, Flush is always vulnerable, and Woolf makes that abundantly clear when he is kidnapped and held in captivity. And if you read Flush, you know this passage well. He found himself in complete darkness. He found himself in chilliness and dampness. As his giddiness left him, he made out a few shapes in a low, dark room, broken chairs, a tumbled mattress. Then he was seized and tied tightly by the leg to some obstacle. Something sprawled on the floor. Whether beast or human being, he could not tell. Now he could see that the floor was crowded with animals of different kinds. Dogs tore and worried a festering bone that they had got between them. Their ribs stood out from their coats. They were half-famished, dirty, diseased, uncombed, unbrushed. Yet all of them, Flush could see, were dogs of the highest breeding, chain dogs, footmen's dogs like himself. You can see a lot of repetition in this book. For a brief period of his life in London, Flush, along with other dogs of the highest breeding, joins the ranks of half-famished, dirty, diseased, uncombed, unbrushed, not because of his shift in his fortunes or his family's fortunes, but because he is stolen. Woolf openly and repeatedly emphasizes the economic inequality in the human world between the forces of Wimpole Street and the jaws of Whitechapel, both quotations, between, quote, the most sedate and civilized quarters of London and filth and disease, with Wimpole Street and Whitechapel living next to one another, cheek by jowl, another quote. This glaring disparity is not only evinced by classism among humans, which is reflected by dogs as indicated above, but it also generates, of course, the poverty and vice and misery in which dog nappers like Mr. Taylor, the head of the pet napping gang, thrive. Elizabeth Barrett Browning rescues Flush. We wonder if his fellow prisoners are as lucky from this dungeon, and soon escapes with him, her new husband and her maid, from class-bound England to the land of the free, to Italy. Elisabetta Marino writes about the way 19th century Italy was renowned as a paradise of exiles, especially for British women, human travelers. For them, it became, quote, this is from Marino's unpublished piece, it became a site of emancipation and empowerment. Susan Squire, Eleanor McNeice, and most recently Jane Goldman are among the many Woolfians who write about the freedom that both Flush and Elizabeth Barrett Browning experience in Italy. It takes being in Italy along with a short trip to England for Flush to sense fully how liberated he now is. And I'm saying England deliberately because they're right there in that part of Great Britain. All right. To Flush, the contrast between the country of his birth and his new homeland is glaring. During his first sojourn in London, he is confined to the back bedroom in Wimpole Street. During his return trip there, he is closely confined to a lodging house sitting room in Welbeck Street. London is a place of disease, namely cholera, poverty, enslavement with dogs led on chains, imprisonment with the front door always locked, and depression, leading dogs like Jane Carlisle's Nero to leap, quote, from a top-story window with the intention of committing suicide, end quote. Though the bulk of his time is spent in confinement, Flush is able to go into high society, namely to meet with his old chums, well-bred dogs like himself. It was in society, or the pillar box and outside the public house, I think that's meant to be ironic, that Flush learned that there are high dogs and low dogs. He had also internalized his home country's racism. In a symposium paper she delivered this past spring, Jane Goldman cites a passage from an earlier draft of Flush that emphasizes the racism of the British establishment. Goldman also notes the racist language of the earlier draft. And you can see this here. He had to consider himself in the social sense déclassé, that he had voluntarily renounced his rank and contracted alliances which were not recognized by the Kennel Club, which the Spaniel Club would ignore, no doubt had its weight in loosening the family ties, the strict bonds of family life. And then here we get to, for if in English, the most tolerant and democratic English peer, shall we say the late Duke of Devonshire or Norfolk, would hardly care to assent strictly to the right of a cold black sun by a negress, of a coif yellow sun by a Chinese lady, to inherit the ancestral splendors of Arundel and Chatworth stately houses. So you can see how he's internalized that. Woolf then revises this passage into the following: just as an English peer who has lived a lifetime in the East and contracted some of the habits of the natives. Rumor hints indeed that he has turned Muslim and had a son by a Chinese washerwoman, finds when he takes his place at court that old friends are ready enough to overlook these aberrations, and he is asked to Chatsworth, though no mention is made of his wife, and it is taken for granted he will join the family at prayers. So the pointers and setters of Wimpole Street welcome Flush among them and overlook the condition of his coat. Flush's coat serves as a vital marker of his class status, namely as a gentleman by birth who carries his pedigree on his back. His coat is analogous to, I'm thinking about the folding imagery that Tomo just talked about, analogous to a gold watch inscribed with the family arms. It is interesting to note the metaphor of the gold watch inscribed with family arms, one saturated with classism. Without his coat, denuded by fleas, Flush is a, quote, different animal, emasculated, diminished, ashamed, nothing, he tells himself. It is in his nothingness, though, that he feels most free. To be nothing, is that not, after all, the most satisfactory state in the world? Let me just see. All right, to be sure, he is most relieved to feel free of fleas, but he is, of course, as free as a dog can be in a world without social class. It is illuminating to compare Flush's life in Italy, and I'm just going to stop screen share because the next quotation is really short and I can read it. It is illuminating to compare his life in Italy to a recent book just published on a thought experiment, Jessica Pierce and Mark Bekoff's A Dog's World, which was published in 1921. This book envisions dogs in a world without humans. Pierce and Bekoff ask, who will dogs become on their own? In terms of appearance, they say, predict that dogs will look more alike. They base their conjecture on wild types of dogs among whom there is little variation in coat color and type. It is we humans who have controlled dogs' phenotypes and shaped their evolution for our purposes. Without us, dogs will evolve to adapt to their geographical constraints. In her representation of Flush in Italy, Woolf seems to anticipate Pearce and Beckoff's vision of dogs in a world without humans. In London, where dog breeds were all the rage, Flush distinguishes among, quote, the pug dog, retriever, bulldog, mastiff, collie, Newfoundland, St. Bernard, fox terrier, or one of the 7 famous families of the Spaniel tribe. In Italy, on the other hand, quote, they were dogs merely, gray dogs, yellow dogs, brindle dogs, spotted dogs, end quote. Pearce and Beckoff emphasize above all that in a world without humans, dogs will be free to be dogs. Not only will they be more uniform in appearance, they will more likely form packs and build alliances, be free to interact with other dogs and make friends with them, range freely and choose their reproductive partners. In short, they will realize their essential dogginess in a world not shaped by class and class markers and not dictated to by human laws. Once in Italy, Woolf writes, quote, Flush had faced the curious and at first upsetting truth that the laws of the Kennel Club are not universal. He had brought himself to face the fact that light top knots are not necessarily fatal, end quote. Being a dog in a human world is to be enslaved. In Florence, quote, the last threads of his old fetters fall from Flush. There are no chains, no park keepers and truncheons, no dog stealers and kennel clubs and spaniel clubs, no corrupt aristocracy, four-wheelers and hansom cabs. In short, no must, no abuse and imprisonment, potential road accidents. In a world of humans, Pearce and Beckoff write, dogs experience untold abuse. Humans physically terrorize and inflict profound psychological suffering on them. David Eberle has written a beautiful essay on the torturous lessons Flush undergoes in his education in the bedroom school, or life in the enclosed, if not cloistered world with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Quote, to resign, to control, to suppress the most violent instincts of his nature, that was the prime lesson of the bedroom school, end quote. Yet all dogs, if healthy and able, are cursorial. That is, they are born to run. And once in Italy, Flush, quote, ran, he raced, his coat flashed, his eyes blazed. He drops his class pretensions, quote, he was the friend of all the world now. All dogs were his brothers, end quote. Why this conversion? By asserting the brotherhood of dogs, Flush is adopting, as the historian Heather Cox Richardson writes, a moral position. He is choosing democracy. But in her narrative, Woolf is suggesting that Flush is not making a moral choice. He is rather falling, like the Carlyle's dog Nero, under the spirit of the age. About Nero, Woolf writes, and I guess I'll share screen for one more second. Here, I'll just show you this quotation. About Nero, Flush writes, the whole question of dogs' relation to the spirit of the age, whether it is possible to call one dog Elizabethan, another Augustan, another Victorian, together with the influence upon dogs of the poetry and philosophy of their masters, deserves a fuller discussion than can be here given it. And she doesn't give it a fuller discussion, but the book speaks for itself. In the spirit of the age, to use Althusserian terms, or rather the spirit of the age, to use Althusserian terms, hails, interpolates, calls on Flush, and he responds with readiness. Or one might use the language of Darwin. He orients himself to this new moral order. As a daughter of Darwin, a kind of daughter of Darwin, and I have Donna Haraway in mind, who calls herself a daughter of Darwin, paraphrasing, Woolf shows that Flush, like the rest of us creatures, must adapt to our environments or leave or fail to survive. When Flush first loses his coat, he bottoms out. He feels like nothing. Rather than continue his plummet into despair, he rises like the lark. He makes the choice to thrive. In London, when he is dog-napped, he despairs. In Italy, when he loses his coat and his class-bound canine companions, he joyfully adapts to his new world of freedom. One might call Flush's jubilant embrace of this change a choice, an ethical choice, even as he's living in a world that makes these choices available to him and all who inhabit it. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie, for that engaging exploration of dog characters. Aili, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you, Tomo, for starting off this conversation. I will be posting the link to my Access copy in the chat here. You should be able to access it, and I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Okay, you should be able to see my slides now. If that's not the case, please let me know by unmuting yourself or saying so in the chat. So first of all, I'd just like to thank Diana for chairing here today, and I'd like to thank you all for being here and for taking the time to be present on Zoom. So I'd like to start my talk here today with an excerpt from Woolf's essay, Street Haunting, a London Adventure, where Woolf describes a walk through the city filled with the imagined lives of others. Into each of these lives, one could penetrate a little way, far enough to give oneself the illusion that one is not tethered to a single mind, but can put on briefly for a few minutes the bodies and minds of others. One could become a washerwoman, a publican, a street singer. And what greater delight and wonder can there be than to leave the straight lines of personality and deviate into those footpaths that lead beneath brambles and thick tree trunks into the heart of the forest where live those wild beasts, our fellow men. In this presentation, I'll explore the ethics of becoming a washerwoman. I'll ask what happens when Woolf and when we leave the straight lines of our personalities and deviate into the minds of others through literature. And more specifically, I'll explore how Woolf attempts or fails to attempt or perhaps refuses to attempt to become a working woman in her fiction. I'll then move on to suggesting that the difficulties that Woolf had in leaving her own upper middle class personality to write the lives of working class women can help us rethink the relationship between empathy and literature. Woolf has often been critiqued for leaving working class voices out of her fiction. So for example, we have Gillian Beer, who reads it as a loss that The Waves does not include working class speech because the novel was initially supposed to depict the life of anybody. Hermione Lee writes that, and I quote, "It's unfortunate that Virginia Woolf is so distant from her working class characters that she described them as half-witted troglodytes and can't even remember whether she called her Swiss maid Marie or Martha." And Alison Light posits that the figure of the servant and the working woman haunts Woolf's experiment in literary modernism and sets a limit to what she can achieve. While I acknowledge the importance of these critiques, I want to linger on the moments that these critics condemn and focus on that limit that Alison Light identifies. I agree that there is a limit, but I suggest that we attend to it closely rather than only dismissing it as a failure for Woolf as a writer. I want to suggest that Woolf's approach to depicting working women is a testament to what a perceptive writer she was. She knew the limits of her perception and she knew the limits of her imagination, and she also knew how interconnected these two are. This awareness, I suggest, is something that we can draw broader wisdoms from. We see Woolf acknowledging the limits of her imagination in the introductory letter she wrote for Life as We Have Known It, an edited collection of life writing by British working class women published in 1931. Here, Woolf details the reasons for why she initially did not want to write the introduction to the book. First of all, she doesn't like introductions, but she's also the wrong person to write this piece, she feels. And she's the wrong person because of her class privilege. In this introductory letter, Woolf identifies herself as a benevolent spectator at best and a hypocrite at worst. She cannot identify with the women in the collection or with their struggle because, and I quote, "If every reform they demand was granted this very instant, it would not touch one hair of my comfortable capitalistic head." She's distant from these women, and she does not try to hide this distance. Rather, the distance has crucial consequences for writers and readers, and Woolf knows this because, and I quote again, "After all, the imagination is largely a child of the flesh." Because imagination is embodied, Woolf knows that she cannot imagine herself in the position of the women whose lives are depicted in the collection. Or as she writes, One could not be Mrs. Giles of Durham because one's body had never stood at the wash tub. One's hands had never wrung and scrubbed and chopped up whatever the meat may be that makes a miner's supper. The picture, therefore, was always letting in irrelevancies. One sat in an armchair or read a book. One saw landscapes and seascapes, perhaps Greece or Italy, where Mrs. Giles or Mrs. Edwards must have seen slag heaps and rows upon rows of slate-roofed houses. Something was always creeping in from a world that was not their world and making the picture false and the game too much of a game to be worth playing. What I want to focus on here is how Woolf acknowledges how a person's life experience influences not only what they see in the world, but also what they imagine. Your personal memories, inevitably shaped by your identity in the form of landscapes and seascapes, will always seep in and control or perhaps contaminate your imagination. Because of this personal and embodied aspect of imagination, because it is so difficult to escape who we are, even in imaginative deviations from the straight lines of our personalities, the game is too much of a game to be worth playing. In other words, the game is too removed from the realities of those one is trying to imagine to be ethical. Throughout this introductory letter, Woolf acknowledges the ethical issues that arise when the more powerful, the more wealthy, and the more comfortable imagine the plights of those less fortunate. As I'll return to in a moment, the ethical and political problem that Woolf identifies here is exactly why empathy has been critiqued in recent years. Before I turn to empathy, however, I want to look at one example of what happens when Woolf attempts to become a working woman through her writing. And I want to exemplify this by turning to a passage from Between the Acts, where Woolf ventures into the mind of Mrs. Sands, the cook at Points Hall. And I apologize here for the false advertising with my title suggesting a focus on 3 of the working women in Woolf's fiction, but I was just not able to resist what I at the time thought was a very catchy reference to the band Crosby, Stills and Nash when I wrote my abstract. So I'll limit myself to Mrs. Sands here today in the interest of time, but my broader aim is to suggest that we need to attend more closely to all of the working women whose voices Woolf does include, however momentarily, such as the years Crosby, Mrs. McNab of To the Lighthouse, and Mrs. Moffat of The Waves. Depicting Mrs. Sands as she makes her way to the barn during the pageant's interlude, Woolf imagines her mind in a dramatically paced paragraph that I'd like to quote almost in its entirety. But Mrs. Sands was approaching. She was pushing her way through the crowd. She had turned a corner. She could see the great open door. But butterflies she never saw. Mice were only black pellets in kitchen jars. Moths she bundles in her hands and put out the window. Bitches suggested only servant girls misbehaving. Had there been a cat, she would have seen it. Any cat, a starved cat with a patch of mange on its rump, opened the floodgates of her childless heart. But there was no cat. The barn was empty. Curiously, the barn is in fact far from empty here. What Mrs. Sands sees and does not see in this paragraph is sharply contrasted with how the barn has been described in the paragraph directly preceding this paragraph. The barn, Woolf tells us in this paragraph, is populated by a butterfly that sunned itself sensuously on a sunlit yellow plate, and mice that slid in and out of holes or stood upright nibbling, and countless beetles and insects of various sorts that burrowed in the dry wood, as well as a stray bitch that had made the dark corner where the sack stood a lying-in ground for her puppies. Mrs. Sands, however, does not see any of this. For her, mice and moths just signify work that needs to get done, dogs misogynistically signify trouble, and butterflies are not seen at all. In these contrasted and contrasting paragraphs, then, Woolf depicts how one's aspect of one's identity, in this case, most notably class and gender, influence something as fundamental as what we see in a barn. Here, as in many other instances where Woolf depicts the thoughts and feelings of working class women, we see an important acknowledgement of how fundamentally one's personal identity shapes act of seeing. Woolf does not reduce Mrs. Sands to a stereotype or to a one-dimensional representation of her class and gender, however. What Mrs. Sands sees in this barn may be deeply shaped by a life of cooking other people's meals, but the domestic worker is not reduced to her class position. While Mrs. Sands may see work that needs to be done where upper class characters would see beauty, We also learned that she would have seen a cat if there was one. And I quote again, had there been a cat, she would have seen it. Any cat, a starved cat with a patch of mange on its rump, opened the floodgates of her childless heart. Woolf's inclusion of Mrs. Sand's soft spot for cats gives us a glimpse of who she is. She has no children, she loves cats, perhaps as a result of this childlessness, and she's quite soft-hearted. In this moment, then, we can see how, as Alison Light noted, the servant figure does haunt Woolf fiction, but it's not, I propose, a moment when we should call Woolf's fiction limited. I suggest instead that we read this passage as connected to Lily Briscoe's wish to have 50 pairs of eyes to look at the world with. Like Lily Briscoe, Woolf knows that a true rendering of reality requires at least 50 pairs of eyes to see with. To imagine what Mrs. Sand sees, she must have Mrs. Sand's eyes, and this poses an ethical as well as an epistemological and a biological problem because our eyes are connected to our brains and therefore to our personal experiences. Or to quote Woolf as she writes in 3 Guinness, the eye is connected with the brain with the nervous system. That system sends its messages in a flash through every past memory and present feeling. Woolf knows how difficult it is to achieve the kind of artistic perception removed from the straight lines of personality that Lily Briscoe longs for, because everything we see is filtered through personal memories of the past and present feelings, which of course also are shaped by our identity and our position in the world. Woolf never tries to hide how difficult it is for her to see through Mrs. Sand's eyes, and how what she calls the impassable barrier between her and someone like Mrs. Sand's renders this woman ultimately unknowable to her as a person of considerable privilege. As she puts it earlier in the novel, what it meant to Mrs. Sands when people missed their trains and she, whatever she might want to do, must wait by the oven, keeping meat hot, no one knew. It is in this acknowledgement of the unknowability of Mrs. Sand's reality to the upper class people at Points Hall and to Woolf herself that I suggest we can find a new model for empathy. This model, I propose, can serve as an ethical corrective against what in recent years has been critiqued as a self-centered and exploitative type of empathy. Empathy's tendency to exploit and to reinforce oppressive structures by allowing the more powerful to imagine the plights of the less powerful has been critiqued from different angles and fields in the past decades, and notably so by feminist scholars. And I'm just going to bring in one example here. So, for example, writer and literary scholar Saidiya Hartman elucidates how the imaginative identification that is part of this kind of empathy often is exploitative by discussing a historical example where a white abolitionist imagines himself in the position of an enslaved person in antebellum United States. In her indictment of the exploitation of others through their suffering, Hartman calls out what she calls the difficulty and slipperiness of empathy, and she concludes that it is often the case, and I quote, that empathy fails to expand the space of the other, but merely places the self in its stead. These kinds of critiques of empathy are particularly important to consider in an era when empathy often is touted as a tool for pro-social action. Woolf's open acknowledgement of the limitations of her own imagination can serve as an ethical corrective against this hypocritical kind of empathy that places the self in the other's position, and in doing so obscures the power dynamics that shape any act of feeling with others. Woolf's awareness of how embodied experience shapes imagination undergirds her hesitation to write working women and provides the foundation for what I'd like to call Woolfian empathy. This kind of empathy is a situated empathy, radically different from the kind of empathy that Hartman and many others critique. Woolfian empathy always acknowledges differences between individuals, the unknowability of the other, and how an individual's environment shapes their mind. Importantly, it's also always acutely aware of its own limitations. It is to these limitations that I suggest that we now turn to explore both Woolf's relationship to her fictional working women and to the possibilities and limitations of empathy. Thank you.
Thank you, Aili, for that insightful investigation. All right, 3 wonderful papers. And now we'll open things up for discussion. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, and you could also raise your hand. Christina.
Yeah, thank you everyone for those papers. They're all great. My question is for Jeanne, and I was just wondering, I'm realizing that I have no sense of how sort of unique to Britain the kind of kennel club lineages of dog breeds and so on is. So is that quite sort of English, or English and its offshoots attitude towards dog breeding, or is it more widely a wider phenomenon, or is it true that in other even European countries attention to breeds is just not a concern?
I can only right now speak to, I don't pay attention to breeds that much and so far in my work, but I can tell you that Harriet Ritvo has written, you probably know her book, The Animal Estate, which she published in 1987. And it's in the bibliography of my paper, but she has a whole chapter on how breeds became a thing in Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century, and then the Kennel Club got formulated. But now I can tell you that the country that is the most obsessed with bred dogs is actually the US. And I can't speak to the rest of Europe now, and I can't even speak to the present status of UK, but it really kind of got started in the UK. And of course, with this whole emphasis on breeds, I mean, Woolf is, and there are so many great books on this. I mean, I had referred to Susan Squire about how Flush is such a critique of class, and dogs become a way of critiquing class. But yeah, it's now the US that is the most concerned with the purebredness of a dog. Thank you.
And
Hi, thanks for these amazing papers. Aili, I'm just wondering, we're not necessarily used to being empathetic to some of the upper class characters. I'm wondering how that operates as well, and whether you've considered the ways in which this daughter of educated men is approaching the different kind of moments in the spectrum of class.
Thank you for that question. Just to make sure I understand it correctly, so I'm thinking of moments in which Woolf extends empathy, or perhaps has trouble extending empathy for the more upper class characters in her writing.
Yeah, in a previous panel, we were talking about Lady Bradshaw, for example, or Lady Bruton. How can we treat those as, if not complex characters, at least complexly rendered?
That's a great question, and I haven't looked into those specifics, but I would love to do so. And my initial inclination is to say that in the case of those ladies, it would have much to do with gender as well. If I'm, and it's perhaps notable that my first example that comes to mind of a character that Woolf has trouble extending empathy to, that's not of working class background, would be Mr. Ramsay. But I think we can see similar issues with some of the ladies. And I'm not saying that it's, she extends empathy or invites empathy for all working class characters. I think that the critiques of her portrayals of them is very valuable across her novels. But I'll have to look at those ladies a bit more carefully. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, Aili, as you were talking, I was thinking about Razzia being empathic toward the sort of battered old woman on the street. And I wondered, is that a real empathy? And then I thought, well, what if that expression came from Mrs. Dalloway? Would it mean something different? Is it different because Razzia is kind of a stranger in a strange land, and so therefore the empathy is more real or sincere? And so I wondered, I guess the question of empathy also depends on kind of the class division, and that also then got me thinking about Tomo's paper about this kind of othering and how one gets past it. But anyway, the question of empathy, I thought, how should I read that passage anyway?
Thank you. I think that that's a great moment, and also a great question about, you know, who gets to empathize, or when is it ethical? And I do think that it has a lot to do with questions of class, and not only class, but also questions of Dalloway. So in this example, if it had been Mrs. Dalloway and not Ritzia who had empathized and, you know, imagined the position of the other and the life of the other, I do think that empathy would have been fundamentally different. So I'm not saying that, you know, one is empathy and another is not empathy. They might have both empathized, but what I think is important, and what I think is often under acknowledged in discussions of empathy, is how the power relations related to class and gender and sexualities and race get obscured if we just focus on the empathetic moment and the goodness of imagining yourself in someone else's position. And I do think that the moment of Mrs. Dalloway empathizing with someone on the street versus Ritzia, who's an outsider, empathizing with someone on the street, would be fundamentally different. I think that those differences are important to attend to.
Can I actually go back to Christina's question? Christina, I just recalled something I read in passing as I was writing this paper, and that is that in Italy, they were starting to get into bred dogs too, also in the 19th century, which then reinforces the point that Woolf is working with a very idealized version of Italy, which she deliberately idealizes. But that's what 19th century travel writers did, British women travel writers in particular did. So by ignoring that, I mean, she's creating this utopia, which I think she must have known is, you know, a creation, I think, simply to make a point that there's a world in which dogs can be happy. Although, of course, is Flush really happy? I mean, one needs to kind of go into that in more detail.
Thanks, Jeannie. Yeah, I was thinking about German breeds as well, and thinking there is kind of a, you know, purebred kind of preoccupation there. So, but I realized that they're just sort of particular strands that I'm aware of, and then places where, you know, I don't have that, and I don't have that kind of association with Italy, but I'm not sure if that's just because I don't know anything about Italy particularly. So yeah, but I think the idea of idealizing it to a certain extent makes a lot of sense as well.
I want to pick up on something that Elsa talked about in her keynote. And I mean, actually, this was in the discussion about how politics and ethics are two different things. And I realized that I was really kind of blending the two when I think about one of my favorite columnists, Heather Richardson, who said that choosing democracy is a moral choice. And so here I was really thought, oh yeah, okay, so Flush chooses democracy. He's making a moral choice, but is that a moral choice? And so anyway, I thought, well, there's no time to kind of work through the problematics of that. But certainly this conference is about kind of interrogating those questions. I mean, is Flush a moral dog? And I see that there are a lot of papers on Flush, so I'm really excited to see what other Woolfians will say about Flush and his moral position.
Can I come in, Jeannie, with something on Flush here? Thank you all three. It's late here in the UK, but I've stayed up to hear this panel and you've not let me down. Just wonderful papers. What's been crystallizing for me is that there's an anachronism going on with Woolf. As you point out, the Kennel Club isn't established, nor is the Spaniel Club, nor is Woolf's source book, which he uses to measure flushes, features. They all come into existence decades after Flushes died. So, you know, there was no Kennel Club, there was no Spaniel Club. Woolf quotes from a book, DL's Dogs, almost verbatim, to talk about the qualities of Flusher's eyes and nose and coat. So, you know, it's decades after Flusher's died that these things are becoming reified and institutionalized. So in effect, we're seeing her collaging something that's coming to being at the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s and 90s. And then she's retrospectively imposing it on the mid-19th century flush. So one can also see how that is looking towards her own era and the rise of eugenics and Nazi Aryan politics. And I think that it's important to sort of bring out those abrupt surfaces in the text. And it's only just, you know, I've been looking at this book for years, and suddenly to just realize that those dates are really important. That although there are some people were very interested in breeds of dogs, whether they were working dogs or court dogs, because of taxes. You know, in the 18th century, they were used, you know, you tax dogs that weren't working dogs to raise money to fight the war against the French. So, you know, there's a sort of political aspect to dog breeding as well. So to be a lap dog, to not be a working dog, is already a political statement. But my other point really is just that anachronism is actually shocking when we realize that it is an anachronism. So Woolf's taking a late 19th century understanding of dog breeding and imposing it on an earlier part of the century with the hindsight of the 1930s.
And isn't it interesting that there were working dogs in UK probably at the time that Flush was living, and there are no working dogs in Flush. I mean, she sets up these very sort of clear kind of dichotomies between bred dogs and street dogs. And then there are, of course, the country dogs.
Yes. Yeah, no, well, I think you're right to point up there, Jeannie, what's missing, you know, because that's to do with, you know, the satire at work there. It's pointing up the parallels between the British aristocracy and those, you know, high breeds of dogs that aren't working dogs, precisely for the class reasons you're talking about.
And another thing she does is, of course, idealize the life of street dogs. And I didn't get into that, but the life of street dogs is pretty short and rough. And so, but, you know, that's again to make that larger point.
Yeah, no, the street dogs, you started the paper with some reference to a woman who was is that right? Rescuing street dogs in Woolf's time.
Yes, and I wrote her name down somewhere, and I'm sorry, I can send it to you, but I'll send you that link. I just forgot to include that.
Anyway, well, thank you very much. That was just such a pleasure and an education. And I'm sorry I don't have questions for the other two papers, but I thought they were both brilliant. And it's just such a tonic to have a great panel on class. Thank you.
Other comments? Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Other comments or questions? Well, indeed, it really has been a wonderful panel, great papers, and a really robust discussion too. So thank you, participants, for coming from around the world.
Okay.
Oh, Aili. Aili had her.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I had a question for Tomo. Thank you. And thank you all for your comments and questions. Tomo, I was wondering, I was really struck by how you talked about the organic metaphors of Mrs. Ramsey versus the beak brass of Mr. Ramsey. And I was wondering, and apologies if you haven't looked at this already, but I started thinking about if you had perhaps looked at if we should say artistic metaphors, perhaps in connection to Lily Briscoe, because I was thinking about how you're talking about how the metaphors described in reference to Mrs. Ramsey visibilize her emotional labor. So I was wondering if you've done any thinking about the artistic labor in connection to the enfolding metaphors of Lily Briscoe, or if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, thank you for comment, Ali. So your comment is about it's about the connection between Lily's writing, Lily's description, and the Mrs. Ramsey's metaphor descriptions.
Yes, exactly. I was just wondering if that's something that you have looked into, and apologies if you haven't. It just struck me as something that could be equally fruitful as your exploration of the metaphors that visibilize Mrs. Ramsey's labor.
Yeah. For Mrs. Ramsey's description I quoted today is initially viewed by James, so from the children's perspective, and the narrator paraphrases his recognition into elaborating description. So that's the most different point between Lily's perspective and the metaphor expression of the Mrs. Ramsey. Then and maybe the transformation of the metaphors relating to Mrs. Ramsey is a part of ethical, a part of some motion, but Lily's trial in express Mrs. Ramsey in some form is a kind of recognition, or not instead of some reaction or motion. She tried to Lily's version is a kind of it's a judgment instead of some movement. So
thank you.
I'm sorry. I cannot bring the proper answer to your question, but I'm sorry. I'm thinking about this question. So okay. Can I ask you your question, Aili? I'm curious about your interpretation about the Woolf's imagination. So imagination towards the working class women. You said Woolf intently limit her imagination towards people of different social class. It's a kind of ethical attitude, you mean? So it's I think it's a rather comment instead of a question, but yeah, today's our morning session. Maitland Detloff thinks that wrote in the Value of Virginia Woolf are Woolf's attitude, Woolf's ethical attitude is a kind of humble attitude on knowing what the person does not know. So maybe Ulrich's attitude toward Ulrich's imaginative attitude is seems to be related to her some judging attitude towards other. So in Detloff's word, some reparative position on knowing others. Yeah. So yeah, very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tomo. I wasn't able to join this morning's sessions because of scheduling conflicts, but I was very happy to hear that everything will be recorded so I can watch this later, and I'll make sure to definitely watch Madeline Detloff's talk. And I also know that she's working on the connections between Virginia Woolf and Iris Murdoch, where I think that they have very, very similar approaches to the humility and the humble approach to knowing the other and the limits of that. So thank you for reminding me.
Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts or comments?
Can I ask a question about perhaps drawing a couple of points together about the nature of embodiment? I was really interested in Aili's talk about Woolf's difficulty in imagining the life of a working class woman, the washerwoman, and it's a question of embodiment, isn't it? And that quotation you put on your slide about after all, the imagination is the child of the flesh, and she sort of can't reach it and imagine what it would be like to live in a body that's got these hands that are, you know, raw from washing things. But in the other papers, in Jeanne's paper, of course, Woolf is kind of imagining herself into the body of a dog, and I just wondered if you could speak to that discrepancy, or if you see it as a discrepancy, what you make of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is a question for me or for Jeanne or for both, perhaps?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, whoever would like to answer it.
Yeah, I think that flush is such an interesting example, and particularly the focus on street dogs in flush, not only, you know, imagining the mind or the experiences of an upper class dog, but also the street dogs. And I think that this is something that Woolf is experimenting with throughout her career. Like she's always trying to imagine what she can't imagine. It can be dogs, it can be, you know, working women, it can be, you know, the perspective of a boat in the voyage out, or the kind of eyeless riding in the waves, trying to describe a moment from nowhere, or the time passage in to the lighthouse. And I think it's interesting that she returns to trying to get there, but then always recognizes her limitations in this. And I think I would say the same for Flush. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's brilliant, but there's always going to be a limit, because we'll always return to the question or the fact that it's a book written by a human after all, and it's a fabulous experiment, but it's written by Virginia Woolf and not by Flush. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Can I also respond to this with a quotation from Tomo's paper? And I'm putting the quotation in the chat. And I think that Woolf emphasizes throughout Flush that here she is, writing this book, that everything is from Flush's point of view. And so he sees the street dogs and everything from his point of view. And so I was just kind of struck by that. And he's a very emotional dog. And so these dogs serve to kind of orient him even in terms of his class position. And so I thought that I was thinking, what's the connection among these papers? And as you were talking, Tomo, I thought, oh yeah, I can see how that applies to this. And then I thought, oh yeah, empathy. And so, I mean, we keep getting into this question of perspective and so on. And then as you were talking, Tomo, I was thinking, well, how did, as in terms of metaphor and Enfolding and Jessica Berman, how does that relate to other novels by Woolf? And so you kind of got me thinking about even the dogs as a kind of metaphor for humans, although I think Woolf really goes out of her way to try to show dogs as dogs and not just as metaphors for class and, and her own grief over sort of never really kind of rekindling that relationship with Vida. So anyway, I was thinking, yeah, there are so many kinds of overlaps among our papers. But again, Flush is so much, it's such a psychological book, it's such an emotional book, and it's so much from his point of view.
Thank you both.
Can I comment? Yeah. So thank you for your comment, Jeanne. Can I? Is it right understanding? So you mean are there some descriptions on dogs which are used as something like metaphors? Yeah. For example, into the Lighthouse, Mrs. Ramsey's complained about injustice on social supplies, with for the milk supply and other. In this dinner scene, her attitude is described in animal description when she was laughed at by our family members, even by her children. So yeah, this is a kind of metaphorical expression of Mrs. Dalloway, of Mrs. Ramsey, and and in other see, for example, into the Lighthouse, when Mrs. Ramsey is alone, she let her imagination go. So in that scene, the narrator describes her stepping into her imaginative world. She parting the curtain, and the curtain is made of some animal coat. So yeah, this description is a kind of metaphorical expression. Yeah, I think, yeah.
Well, we're nearing the end of the session, but any last comments or thoughts? Okay, well, again, thank you, Tomo, Jeanne, and Aili for presenting papers. Sharon, thank you for hosting and monitoring the chat, and everyone who came and participated in discussions and comments. Thank you too for your input. It's been a wonderful panel. So,
Thank you all. And I'm going to stop the recording and then end the session. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.